Hello, welcome back to the Liberal Union 911. On December 17, 2025, Washington woke under a low metallic winter sky, the kind that presses down on the Capitol when history feels unfinished, as the White House prepared for a primetime presidential address meant to steady a nation facing simultaneous pressure from abroad and within. And from the first light of morning, the mood across official Washington was tense, purposeful, and unmistakably brittle, with aides moving briskly through West Wing corridors while lawmakers traded barbed statements on cable news, all against the backdrop of a rapidly escalating confrontation in the Caribbean, where U.S. naval assets were enforcing a newly declared maritime blockade around Venezuela, a move the administration insists is a targeted enforcement action, but which has already redrawn geopolitical lines across the region. The president, speaking later from the East Room beneath carefully calibrated lighting and flanked by flags arranged to signal both authority and restraint, framed the blockade as a necessary act of economic containment, arguing that allowing sanctioned oil flows to continue would, in his words, fund instability, corruption, and regional collapse. And while the address was measured in cadence, its implications were unmistakably sharp, signaling a decisive turn in U.S. posture toward Caracas, with senior officials privately acknowledging that this was the most aggressive maritime action in the Caribbean in decades, even as they stressed that rules of engagement were defensive and narrow, a claim echoed earlier in the day by White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt, who told reporters in a packed briefing room, her voice steady but her tone unyielding, that this is not an act of war, this is an act of enforcement, and the United States will not apologize for defending the integrity of international sanctions. Words that landed heavily as footage filtered in from the Caribbean, showing gray-hulled U.S. destroyers cutting across sunlit waters, their radar domes scanning the horizon, while commercial tankers idled miles offshore, caught in a geopolitical crosscurrent. In Venezuela, the blockade's immediate effect was both practical and psychological. Ports slowed to a crawl, fuel queues lengthened, and government-aligned media blasted denunciations of imperial aggression, while regional leaders convened emergency calls, worried less about ideology than about spillover, migration, and market shock, concerns that seemed justified as early data showed oil futures jumping within hours of the announcement, rippling outward to global markets already strained by uncertainty. Yet even as attention focused southward, the administration faced mounting scrutiny at home over a separate, staggering figure released quietly by the Department of Homeland Security earlier in the day, confirming that an estimated 2.5 million migrants had exited or transited through U.S. border systems over the past 12 months, a number that immediately became a political accelerant, cited by critics as evidence of systemic failure and by allies as proof of regional instability beyond U.S. control. And nowhere was the reaction louder than on Capitol Hill, where lawmakers seized on the data to reinforce sharply diverging narratives, with Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene telling a conservative gathering that afternoon that 2.5 million people didn't just wander in by accident, they were invited by weakness, a line she later repeated on social media as proof, she said, that the administration's foreign policy and border policy were two sides of the same broken coin. Democrats, meanwhile, countered that the exodus figure reflected hemispheric collapse driven by climate stress, political repression, and economic dislocation, factors now worsened, they warned, by the Venezuelan blockade. And this clash of interpretations underscored a broader truth about the day's events, that foreign conflict and domestic strain were no longer parallel storylines, but intersecting pressures feeding into the same national debate about capacity, control, and consequence. That debate intensified further as the Labor Department released revised employment figures showing the national unemployment rate climbing to 4.6%, a sharp and politically dangerous uptick that economists attributed to a mix of slowing consumer demand, higher borrowing costs, and layoffs concentrated in logistics, retail, and energy-adjacent sectors, with the timing of the report proving particularly problematic for the White House, landing just hours before the president's address and forcing last-minute revisions to his economic language, even as administration officials emphasized that wage growth remained stable and that the labor market, while cooling, was not collapsing, a distinction that did little to blunt the immediate political impact. In closed-door meetings, Democratic strategists acknowledged that the unemployment figure risked undercutting recent messaging about economic resilience, while Republicans framed it as confirmation of what they called policy exhaustion. And the atmosphere in Washington reflected that friction, with cable news chyrons toggling rapidly between images of naval patrols in the Caribbean and factory gates closing in the Midwest, a visual shorthand for a country stretched across competing fronts. The president attempted to bridge that divide in his address, moving deliberately from foreign policy to domestic economics, arguing that global instability inevitably washes ashore and that decisive action abroad, including the Venezuelan blockade, was intended not only to enforce sanctions but to prevent further migratory and economic shockwaves from reaching U.S. communities already under strain, a linkage that some analysts praised as strategic coherence, while others criticized as rhetorical overreach, noting that military pressure often accelerates displacement rather than containing it. Outside the White House gates, small groups of demonstrators gathered despite the cold, some waving signs condemning the blockade as reckless, others demanding tougher enforcement at the border, their chants overlapping in a discordant reminder that consensus remains elusive, while inside the Beltway, the machinery of governance ground on, with committee hearings, caucus meetings, and back-channel negotiations all unfolding against the ticking clock of the evening address. In the Caribbean, meanwhile, the atmosphere was tense and watchful, sailors operating under heightened alert as regional coast guards coordinated with U.S. commanders to avoid miscalculation, and diplomats quietly worked phones in an effort to prevent an incident that could spiral beyond control, particularly as Venezuelan officials vowed to challenge the blockade through international bodies, setting the stage for legal and diplomatic battles that could stretch well into the coming year. By nightfall, as the president concluded his address and the networks cut to panels of analysts parsing every phrase, the shape of the day became clear, not as a single crisis, but as a convergence, a moment when international conflict, migration pressure, economic anxiety, and political infighting collided in real time, leaving Americans with a sense of movement but not resolution, of action without certainty, and of a government attempting to project steadiness amid accelerating change. And as lights dimmed in the capital and naval vessels maintained their positions under Caribbean stars, the unanswered questions lingered about how long the blockade would last, whether unemployment would continue to climb, how the migration figures would reshape the political landscape, and whether the tone set on this cold December day would define the year to come or merely mark another chapter in an era where crisis is not an interruption to governance, but its constant companion.